Welcome back here at Goldberg. Today we'll be talking about the whole nonsense in Brazil because I'm getting sick of these shrill, apocalyptic right wing alarmists. Anytime an election doesn't go their way, they begin forecasting that the sky is falling. Brazilian is a socialist communist takeover. It's like you clearly have no idea what the hell you're talking about. You don't understand history. You just want to be outraged by something. It's the constant fall back, retreat to the citadel mindset that a lot of right wing people have. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's somewhat infused by religious motivations or outlooks, but regardless, Brazil has been socialistic since, at minimum, the administration of Getulio Vargas well over half a century ago. He, as I noted in one of my books, he took a lot of inspiration from the policies of Mussolini. But then in the 1960s, you have a period of military dictatorship which lasts around about till the mid 1980s, give or take, with the rise of Jose Sarney to be president, member of the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party. He serves, and then in 1989, you have another presidential election, which is won by this fellow, Collor de Mello, kind of pretty boy, anti-corruption, pro-privatization, pro-market. He actually defeats Luis Ignacio LOL da Silva, who would run for president a total of 4 times before being successful in 2002. And what Collor does is massive privatization, trying to cut government, reorient towards a neoliberal agenda. This is very popular. Fuji shock type neoliberal reforms in Latin America in the 1990s, which had mixed results to say the least. Because when you implement all these free market policies and deregulation on an underdeveloped country, yes, if you are already part of a middle class, you have resources, you'll probably do well. If you are in a rural area or you're in poverty, you're probably going to get screwed. And that has been almost to the note what has happened in these nations that have adopted a neoliberal agenda. Despite his anti-corruption posturing, Mello is impeached after being accused of corruption by his brother, among other people. He's removed from office and replaced by a stopgap measure, Itamar Franco. But in 1994, again, LOL da Silva is defeated, but this time by Cardoso, who is a member of the Brazilian Social Democracy Party. However, social democracy, much like in Portugal, Social Democratic Party is actually moderate to center-right pro-business. The Socialist Party itself in Portugal is more of the traditional center-left organization or vessel. Cardoso more or less continues the neoliberal policies through to the end of his term in 2003. And why do I bring up the neoliberalism? It's important. Highly advise if you're interested in economics or politics, read this book. This is fantastic. He just breaks down that what happened in reality is most rich countries used subsidies, used state-run corporations, used tariffs to develop their industries to the point where they could actually compete, and then they started pushing free market. But when it came to developing countries, they went in and said, oh, you have to be free market from the beginning. When, like I said, there are people that are still living in these rural conditions, maybe subsistence farmers, you force it on them, more likely that you're just going to generate a lot of poverty and issues with inflation, which has been almost always the case if you look at what happened in Latin America. Even under Pinochet, when they went and tried to privatize everything, they had to go back on it in the early 80s because the banking system was collapsing. They had to renationalize a lot of the banks. So it's not as simple as just be pro-market, pro-business. You need a country to have time to develop industries. Otherwise, what will be the result? Great poverty, and foreigners will control all your industries. That's what's happened in a lot of these poorer countries. So come 2002, there's been an economic crisis in Brazil. Lula comes back and defeats Jose Serra, who was also a member of the Social Democracy Party, becomes president. Now, it's an interesting point to note, his vice president is Jose Alencar, member of the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, which is generally speaking a center-right or moderate pro-business party. I want people to understand this because there's a lot of this, oh my God, Lula's going to create a communist dictatorship. You have no idea what the hell you're talking about, so just sit down and go back to listening to, Sean Hannity. What Lula did is he came in. By the way, he went along with the agreement that was first proffered by the IMF and agreed to by Cardoso, the former president. Now, if you are pro IMF, which is a globalist organization that subverts countries and forces them to do what the IMF wants in terms of budgeting, inflation, privatization, interest rates, you are not really this radical independent leftist. Let's be very clear. He comes in, he is largely pro-market. He does increase the family allowance program, which is credited with bringing at least 20 million people out of poverty, statistically speaking. Growth overall, the economy grows by like 32 some percent throughout his administration, average over 4% a year. This is pretty good for a radical communist socialist, to be perfectly honest, which he was not, of course. There is, of course, deforestation does happen under Lula. So Marina Silva, the Afro-Brazilian member of the Green Party, she was environment minister, but when she started pushing back on GMOs, on biofuels, on expansion and development in the rainforest, eventually she got forced out. So once more, the idea, oh, they're radical, tree-hugging nutcases. No. Now, of course, they did support some of the status quo state-owned enterprises like Petrobras, which was involved in some scandals later on. But the idea that Brazil was this socialist, anti-capitalist country under Lula is completely ridiculous. This is a period when people were projecting that Brazil was going to, with BRICS, they were going to become a world power because they were so strong economically, and they'd been able to balance in this almost third way manner the market and social welfare. So no, it's not correct. Stop taking stuff out of your ass just because you're a hysterical right-wing person, okay? LOL da Silva's term ends in 2010/early 2011. He is replaced by this lady here, Dilma Rousseff, his chief of staff. She used to be a Marxist guerrilla, then she's joined the Workers' Party. She defeats Jose Serra again by a convincing margin, the guy who ran in 2002. And she is, more or less continues the same trajectory. Her VP, by the way, Michel Temer of the Brazilian Democratic Movement, another pro-business type. This, by the way, is Marina Silva. She's the one I was just talking about. No relation to LOL da Silva. And this is Accio Nieves. So this would have been the 2014 presidential election when some of the corruption problems were just billowing to the top. But Nieves almost won, but I think he lost by 3 percentage points. And after that, you see this movement to essentially clamp down on corruption, led by the judge Sergio Moro, who frankly I think should be president of Brazil because he's probably the best of the worst. He goes after a lot of people. Now, they can't nail Rousseff specifically on the corruption, so they get her on like a campaign finance violation, and she gets impeached in 2016. Temer becomes president, starts rapidly expanding deforestation of the Amazon, being pro-business. So why would a socialist choose a pro-business VP? And not to even say that the Workers' Party was anti-business entirely, because it's not the case at all. It's sort of that whole dynamic where there are some right-wingers, if a person comes in and says, okay, we're going to do this that's good for the economy, we're also going to do this for some poor people, they get outraged. How dare the poor people get something? It's sort of like when, and this is, well, that's not even a perfect example, but if you looked at with Obamacare, the GOP establishment was not angry about Obamacare itself. It was the main issue was that the mandate tax was going to go to the government instead of going to the corporations. That was their big sticking point. It's kind of hilarious, but also sad in a way. But this corruption scandal, Operation Car Wash, embroils a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. So, in fact, Eduardo Cunha, who was the Speaker of the House who went after Rousseff, got her impeached, he was sentenced to over 20 years in prison for corruption. They even investigated Nieves here. I know he's like Two-Face, as you can see. Temer, after he leaves office as president because Bolsonaro comes in, Temer is arrested for corruption. This is an endemic problem, but the funny thing is that Brazil, as much as we might laugh at them, Brazil has a justice system that actually goes after elites on both sides of the aisle, and they put one of the members of Odebrecht, the executive, in prison for like 2 decades. Imagine that. Imagine if we actually went and charged people like Lloyd Blank fine and the Treasury Secretary and all these criminals. What about Hillary Clinton? I mean, there's a lot of stuff to go around. Newt Gingrich should probably be locked up. A lot of stuff we could talk about there. So, LOL da Silva had initially intended to run for president in 2018, but he was also caught up in a scandal, sentenced to 9 years in prison. So that precluded him from being a candidate, although he was later, the conviction was quashed by judges he had appointed. So Bolsonaro runs against Haddad, who was the replacement candidate. Haddad was the mayor of Sao Paulo, and his VP was a legit communist, but he lost to Bolsonaro, of all people, by like 10 or 11 percentage points. Bolsonaro had built a career as being a fairly like pro-populist welfare type right-winger, but then he went and made peace with the neoliberal crowd, the big business, to become president. So it really goes to show you who's in power in most countries. No matter how much someone wants to scream about being oh, I'm this, I'm that. Well, yeah, but if they go against the power elite, they typically are folded pretty quickly. As president, Bolsonaro has a mixed record. He definitely was big into privatization, expanding deforestation. He did attempt, I think, to raise the minimum wage, but he somewhat abandoned certain aspects of his economically populist policies when he became president, again, more than likely to keep the business people happy. That's one of the big problems with the right-wingers. They wonder why they don't perform that well. Maybe it's because you're not actually making an effort to serve all the people. You're serving your elite donor class. But Bolsonaro wasn't terrible. Mainly, like with Trump, the whole COVID thing made him lose a lot of face as this strong guy who can project power, so it's not really that much of a surprise. And he loses narrowly, and people say, oh, it's fraud. Well, show the fraud. It's like I've been talking about. Brnovich, the fairly right-wing pro-Trump Republican attorney general, he's not a freaking never-Trumper. He recently came out and said, you guys have no evidence of this fraud. You've been parroting it for a couple of years. You have no evidence of it. You just keep, yeah. Present evidence. They don't have any. So just because you lose an election does not automatically mean it's fraud, and you can't prove it. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but you need to actually have evidence. And the evidence that these people, they keep popping up like in comments, and they'll tell me, is stuff that if you actually do a good faith investigation, you'll find out, no, it's not fraud. It's that you don't understand how the process works. Specifically regarding LOL da Silva in 2022, you might notice an interesting dynamic. His vice president is Geraldo Alckmin. Now, Alckmin was the Brazilian social democracy candidate against Lula in 2006. He lost by like 20 percentage points, but he ran with Lula this time around. He switched to the Socialist Party, but that doesn't mean anything because Bolsonaro himself was elected as a member of the Social Liberal Party. Yeah, I don't think he's a social liberal. But what's important about Alckmin, he's kind of the Mitt Romney of Brazil, the milquetoast, moderate pro-business. This is another type of coalition. This is a signal that, we're not going to really be that radical. Sure, Lula could try, but you have to remember that the Congress has a right-wing majority, so they'll probably just impeach him if he does stuff they don't like. And even if he doesn't, they'll probably just impeach him. It's not the sky is falling. People need to just take a deep breath and look at stuff. Now, who knows? Maybe he'll go crazy banana Biden on folks, but there again, he'll probably get impeached. So stop following these hysterical, cringy right-wing headlines. These people are low IQ. They just want clicks. They're not interested in reality. And in a weird way, they make people more extreme and radicalized based upon bad information. At least take a good, and if you see, okay, this dude is a legit radical communist, that's one thing. But if you turn out, okay, it's basically a center-left pro-business candidate, you need to be, oh, all right, maybe it's not going to be that crazy. You can take a deep breath and just keep living your life. Be vigilant, but don't be a nutcase. That's all I'm saying.